Iran said it could turn the Strait of Hormuz into a choke point. Then the numbers came in. 20 million barrels of oil moved out of the Strait in 24 hours. Around 72 ships passed through. Prices dropped. Tankers that had waited outside the danger zone began moving again, and suddenly the threat that was supposed to freeze the world started looking like something much more dangerous for Tehran. A bluff with consequences. Look at the timing. Iran had spent days reminding the world that Hormuz was not just water. It was a pressure valve, a narrow gate, a place where geography becomes a weapon. Roughly 1/5 of global oil consumption depends on that route. A major share of liquefied natural gas moves through it too. When Hormuz shakes, the world does not just watch a map. It watches the price of fear. But here is the part they do not want to explain. If a country threatens to close the most important oil artery on Earth, the world is supposed to panic. Shipping companies are supposed to freeze. Insurance costs are supposed to explode. Oil markets are supposed to price in catastrophe. And yes, for a moment that happened. Tankers slowed. Crews waited. Mine warnings spread. Everyone looked at that narrow blue passage and asked the same question. Can Iran really close it? That was the wrong question. The real question was never whether Iran could create danger in the Strait of Hormuz. Of course it could. Mines, missiles, patrol boats, drones, political threats, militia signaling, all of that can turn a shipping lane into a nervous system. The real question was whether Iran could close Hormuz without also closing a door on itself. That is where the gamble began to backfire. Because Iran does not sit outside the oil system like a man holding a remote detonator from a safe hilltop. Iran is inside the system. Its own oil needs movement. Its own bargaining power depends on revenue, sanctions relief, and diplomatic oxygen. Its own future depends on whether it can turn crisis into concessions without triggering a mechanism that strips away its leverage. And that mechanism is exactly what began to appear. Military escort routes, mine clearing operations, warnings from maritime authorities, emergency corridors along Oman, international coordination, evacuation planning for thousands of sailors, data firms tracking vessel movements, governments telling markets, in effect, watch the ships, not the slogans. The question is not what they said, the question is what they moved. And what moved was oil. That is why this story is bigger than a headline saying Hormuz reopened. Reopened is too simple. Closed is too simple. The Strait of Hormuz did not return to normal. It entered a new phase. A phase where Iran could still create danger, but where the United States and its partners were trying to prove something much more devastating. That Iran could no longer decide alone when the world breathes. Think of Hormuz as a door in a crowded theater. For years, Iran's message was simple. If you push us too far, we can lock the exit. Everyone in the room understood the threat. Oil consumers understood it. Gulf monarchies understood it. China understood it. Europe understood it. The United States understood it. A locked door creates panic before anyone even touches the handle. But this time, the door did not stay locked. That matters because power is not only the ability to create a crisis. Power is the ability to control what happens after the crisis begins. Iran showed it could scare the room. But Washington tried to show it could organize the evacuation, keep the lights on, and force everyone to notice that the door was still being used. That is not a small difference. Now pause there. This is where public theater and strategic reality separate. On television, the dramatic story is Iran threatening Hormuz. In the market, the dramatic story is oil still moving. In diplomacy, the dramatic story is a fragile deal around a 60-day window. In military logistics, the dramatic story is not a speech. It is a convoy. Convoys are not rhetoric. They are proof of intent. Iran wanted the world to believe the Strait was a lever. The United States wanted the world to believe it was a managed risk. Those are two completely different stories. One story says Tehran controls the pressure. The other says the pressure can be contained. And in geopolitics, once your threat can be contained, it becomes less like a sword and more like a smoke alarm. Unallowed. But not decisive. I want you to see the model underneath this. Call it the choke point paradox. A state that controls a vital passage can threaten the world by closing it. But if that state also depends on the same passage, then every escalation tightens around its own ribs. The more it proves the passage is dangerous, the more outsiders are invited to organize around it. A choke point becomes powerful until it becomes too important to leave in one country's hands. That is the paradox Iran ran into. The Strait of Hormuz is not a normal bargaining chip. It is not a border crossing that can be opened and closed quietly. It is not a customs dispute. It is not a port fee negotiation. It is an artery attached to the global economy. When Iran touches it, everyone feels the pulse. And when everyone feels the pulse, everyone starts planning around Iran. That planning is the real danger for Tehran. Follow the money, then follow the fear. Mine it. Oil markets did not just react to statements. They reacted to barrels. They reacted to ships. They reacted to reports that 20 million barrels had exited in a day, that vessels were moving under military escort, that tankers stranded in the Gulf were beginning to leave, that prices were falling instead of spiraling. Markets can be emotional, but they are not blind. If the fear trade had held, Iran would have gained leverage. Every consumer government would have felt pressure. Every importer would have stared at inflation. Every politician would have calculated the cost of gasoline, electricity, shipping, and voter anger. That is the magic of Hormuz as a threat. It turns foreign policy into a household bill. But when the fear trade broke, the leverage changed hands. Suddenly, Washington could say, we kept the oil moving. Gulf states could say, we need more guarantees. Shipping companies could say, we want safe corridors. Maritime authorities could say the Strait is open but under conditions. And Iran had to face the uncomfortable truth that the world was not simply begging it to reopen the gate. The world was learning how to keep using the gate with less permission from Tehran. This is where the official story begins to crack. Because publicly, Iran's threat was framed as strength. The Revolutionary Guard could signal punishment. Tehran could link pressure in Hormuz to Israeli action in Lebanon. Iranian media could present the Strait as a battlefield of sovereignty. That creates a powerful image, a defiant state standing at the mouth of the Gulf, holding the world economy hostage. But the operational reality was messier. The same reports showed vessels moving again. Qatar-linked LNG traffic began to resume. Very large crude carriers moved. Tanker traffic rose from its lowest point. The number of crossings still remained below the pre-war level, but the direction mattered. The system was injured, not paralyzed. And an injured system can recover in ways that punish the attacker. That recovery did not mean Iran had no power. That would be a mistake. Iran still had power to raise costs, spread uncertainty, delay shipments, increase insurance risk, and keep crews under threat. Mines do not need to sink half the world's fleet to change behavior. One mine warning can move billions of dollars in routing and insurance. But disruption is not the same as domination. Iran's problem is that it needed the world to believe in domination. It needed the threat to feel final. It needed Hormuz to look like a switch Tehran could flip. Instead, the evidence suggested something more limited and more dangerous for Iran. Tehran could create a crisis, but not fully control the crisis once it expanded beyond Iran's own coastline. That is a huge strategic difference. Look at the human layer, too. The International Maritime Organization spoke of evacuation planning for around 11,000 sailors caught in the region. 14 sailors had reportedly died in the wider conflict. This detail matters because it pulls the story away from abstract barrels and into human risk. Hormuz is not only a line on an oil chart. It is steel, sweat, fear, and trapped crews waiting for governments to decide whether the sea is safe. That human risk strengthens the case for outside coordination. Once sailors are trapped, once evacuation corridors are discussed, once mine clearing becomes a public security function, the Strait stops being only a regional dispute. It becomes a global maritime emergency. And the more global it becomes, the harder it is for Iran to say, this is ours to manipulate. That is why the backfire is not just economic. It is institutional. Iran may have wanted to show that no one can ignore its position. But by turning Hormuz into a crisis, it encouraged governments, shipping groups, military commands, and international bodies to build a response architecture. An architecture is different from a reaction. A reaction fades. An architecture stays. And once built, it can be used again. The United States understood that. When Chris Wright said the United States was taking away Iran's ability to close the Strait, the important part was not the bravado. The important part was the evidence behind the claim. Ships moving, escort routes functioning, oil leaving, prices falling. The message was aimed at Tehran, but also at markets. Do not buy panic, buy movement. That message mattered because markets are battlefields too. A missile can hit a ship, a mine can close a route, but panic can do something even larger. Panic can raise oil prices before the physical shortage arrives. Panic can tax every economy at once. Panic can make a threat successful, even if the threat is only partially executed. That is why oil prices falling after Hormuz traffic resumed was so damaging to Iran's psychological position. It meant the panic had limits. Now look at Washington's own pressure. The United States was not acting from pure confidence. It had its own vulnerabilities. A war around Hormuz can become a domestic political nightmare. Energy prices touch voters faster than foreign policy speeches. If oil spikes, inflation fears return. If shipping stalls, consumers feel it. If a president wants to claim control before an election cycle, gasoline becomes a political instrument. So Washington had to prove calm quickly. That is why the speed of the flow mattered. 20 million barrels in 24 hours was not just an energy statistic. It was a political message wrapped in a shipping report. It said, the artery is open enough. The world is not bleeding out. The threat is being managed. And in a crisis, managed is sometimes the most powerful word. But do not mistake managed for solved. The strongest evidence against a simple American victory is also inside the same facts. Ships still needed military escort. Some vessels avoided the main traffic separation scheme. Mine clearing was still expected to take time. Maritime authorities still issued warnings. Tankers remained stranded. Insurance risk did not vanish just because several cargoes moved. This was not a clean reopening. It was a controlled emergency. That matters because Iran still holds residual leverage. A country does not need to shut every lane forever to remain dangerous. It only needs to keep the cost of certainty high. If every captain needs military guidance, if every insurer recalculates, if every LNG buyer watches vessel tracking screens at midnight, then Iran has not disappeared from the equation. It has simply lost the ability to pretend the equation belongs only to Tehran. That is why the story is not Iran failed completely. The sharper story is that Iran overplayed a tool that works best when it remains partly imaginary. The threat to close Hormuz is most powerful before it is tested. Before the test, everyone imagines the worst. After the test, everyone measures the actual damage. And measurement is dangerous for intimidation. Because once fear is measured, it can be priced. Once it is priced, it can be managed. Once it is managed, it can be reduced. This is the nightmare for any state that relies on ambiguity. Ambiguity lets you appear larger than you are. It lets your enemies scare themselves. It lets markets do your work for you. But when you force the confrontation, ambiguity turns into data. Ships either pass or they do not. Barrels either move or they do not. Prices either rise or fall. And this time, enough move to damage the myth. Iran's second problem was the Lebanon connection. According to the reports, Iranian-linked messaging tied the renewed closure threat to Israeli strikes in Lebanon. That made sense emotionally. It allowed Tehran to present Hormuz as part of a regional resistance framework. Israel hits Lebanon, Iran pressures the world economy. The message was, you cannot isolate battlefields anymore. But strategically, that link created another problem. It made Hormuz hostage not only to U.S.-Iran diplomacy, but also to Israeli behavior. And Israel was not a direct party to the same fragile understanding. Netanyahu signaled that Israel would protect its own interests and maintain operations as long as necessary. That means Tehran was trying to turn Hormuz into leverage, while one of the key triggers sat partly outside the agreement. That is not leverage, that is volatility. Volatility can hurt enemies, but it can also scare partners. Gulf states do not want Hormuz transformed into a punishment tool every time Lebanon heats up. Qatar depends on LNG exports. Oman depends on maritime stability. Iraq, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and global importers all calculate risk differently. Even countries that dislike American pressure may not want Iran converting the Gulf into a switchboard for every regional battlefield. An alliance is not a family photo. It is a room full of countries pretending not to count the knives. That is why Gulf anxiety matters. Reports around Marco Rubio's meeting suggested regional allies wanted answers, not speeches. Answers. They worried about sanctions relief, a possible $300 billion reconstruction fund, Iran's missile capabilities, and whether a deal would reward Tehran without restraining its future coercive tools. In simple terms, they feared Washington might buy calm today and finance a stronger Iran tomorrow. That fear cuts both ways. For the United States, sanctions relief can be a leash. Offer money, assets, or reconstruction support in exchange for restraint. For Gulf states, the same package can look like fuel poured into a machine they already fear. To Washington, it may look like diplomacy. To Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Doha, and others, it may look like a future missile budget wearing a peace label. Here is the part they do not want to explain. A deal that lowers oil prices can still raise strategic fear. That is what makes this crisis so unstable. Consumers want cheap energy. Washington wants diplomatic control. Iran wants sanctions relief without humiliation. Israel wants freedom of action against threats it sees as existential. Gulf states want Iran contained but not a war in their front yard. Everyone wants stability. Nobody defines stability the same way. This is where the 60-day window becomes critical. Iran was reportedly given time to decide what to do about highly enriched uranium. That is not a side issue. That is the core pressure point. Hormuz, Lebanon, sanctions relief, maritime corridors, and oil flows are all connected to the same question. Can a temporary calm be converted into a strategic settlement before one side uses the pause to reposition? A ceasefire is not peace. It is a room with the guns lowered. Sometimes the guns are lowered because trust is growing. Sometimes they are lowered because everyone needs to reload. That is why you cannot read falling oil prices as the end of the story. Markets are fast, strategy is slower. Oil can drop today because tankers move. But if the nuclear file cracks, if Israel escalates in Lebanon, if Iran plants new ambiguity around mines, if insurance premiums spike again, the market can reverse. The Strait of Hormuz is not a healed wound. It is a bandage under pressure. Now let me make the argument against my own thesis. A smart critic could say Iran did not backfire at all. Iran proved exactly what it wanted to prove, that one threat from Tehran can make the entire world stop and look. Tankers slowed, maritime warnings spread, oil prices moved. The United States had to intervene, escort, negotiate, reassure markets, and send officials through the region. That does not look like weakness. That looks like leverage. That argument deserves respect. Because Iran did show disruptive power, it did remind the world that geography still matters. It did force major powers to spend attention, military resources, diplomatic capital, and political energy on a narrow passage of water. In an era of sanctions, pressure, and military strikes, forcing your enemies to react is itself a form of power. So why do I still call it a backfire? Because coercion has two parts, shock and extraction. Shock gets attention, extraction gets results. Iran achieved shock. But the evidence suggests it did not fully control extraction. Instead of simply forcing concessions, it triggered a counter-system. Escorted routes, maritime coordination, mine clearing, public vessel data, emergency planning, Gulf diplomacy, and American claims that the Strait could stay open despite Tehran. That is the difference. If Iran had closed Hormuz and the world had begged on Tehran's terms, the gamble would have worked. But if Iran threatened Hormuz and the world built tools to reduce that threat, the gamble becomes self-defeating. You do not want your enemy to practice surviving your favorite weapon. That is exactly what may have happened. The first time you reveal a weapon, it terrifies. The second time, everyone studies it. The third time, someone builds a procedure. This is why Iran's position is now more complicated than it was before the crisis. It can still threaten, it can still disrupt, it can still create costs. But the world now has recent evidence of how much oil can move during a managed emergency. It has recent evidence of how escort routes function. It has recent evidence of where ships hesitate and where they resume. That evidence becomes a map for the next crisis. And maps reduce fear. The deepest irony is that Iran may have helped Washington sell a new security role in the Gulf. For years, many regional actors wanted less dependence on the United States, or at least more balance. But when Hormuz becomes unstable, the old question returns. Who can keep the artery open when panic begins? That question benefits the country with naval reach, coalition networks, and market messaging power. Not Iran. Iran's gamble also exposed the limits of symbolic escalation. Symbolic escalation is when a state does something dramatic not because it wants full war, but because it needs the image of resistance. It wants to show domestic audiences it is not weak. It wants allies to believe it can punish enemies. It wants adversaries to calculate risk. But symbols can become traps. If the symbol is too small, it looks fake. If it is too large, it invites retaliation. If it damages everyone, it creates pressure. If it damages yourself, it becomes absurd. Hormuz is the ultimate symbol with a self-harm clause built into it. Iran can threaten the artery, but it also needs blood from that artery. That is why this was such a dangerous gamble. Sanctions are not a wall. They are a slow tightening belt around the ribs of a state. Iran has lived under that pressure for years. Revenue matters. Access matters. Relief matters. If a deal offers financial breathing room, Iran has to think carefully before turning the same sea lane into a long-term hostage crisis. Because you cannot collect the benefits of de-escalation while proving you are still the central source of escalation. That contradiction is now visible. And once visible, it becomes political ammunition for everyone else. For Washington hawks, it proves Iran cannot be trusted. For Gulf states, it proves any deal must include maritime security and missile limits. For Israel, it proves pressure must remain. For energy traders, it proves Hormuz risk is real but not absolute. For Tehran's own hardliners, it may prove the regime should have gone further. That is how crises multiply after the cameras move on. Everyone extracts a different lesson. Now, what should you watch over the next 48 to 72 hours? Watch the traffic numbers first, not the speeches. Count the ships. If crossings continue moving toward the pre-war level around 125 passages a day, Iran's pressure campaign loses more psychological force. If traffic stalls again, especially LNG or very large crude carriers, the fear premium can return fast. Ships will tell you what diplomats hide. Second, watch mine clearing and routing advisories. If maritime authorities keep telling vessels to avoid the main traffic separation scheme and use alternate corridors, then Hormuz is open but not normal. That distinction matters. An open strait under emergency routing is not peace. It is a patient walking with a cane. The cane is evidence. Third, Israeli strikes continue or expand, and Iran again links Hormuz to Lebanon. The entire ceasefire architecture becomes vulnerable. The most dangerous trigger may not come from a formal collapse of U.S.-Iran talks. It may come from a battlefield that sits just outside the agreement, but inside Iran's narrative of resistance. That is where the next spark may hide. So do not let the falling oil price fool you into thinking the crisis ended. And do not let Iran's threat fool you into thinking Tehran controlled the board. What happened in Hormuz was more revealing than a closure and more fragile than a reopening. Iran tried to show the world it could choke the artery. The United States tried to show the artery could keep pumping. Markets watched the blood flow and adjusted their fear. For now, the flow won. But the deeper question remains. If a country's strongest weapon only works when everyone is afraid to test it, what happens when the world finally tests it and survives?